Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for coming on this rainy evening. My name's Cass Dickinson. I'm one of the three co-directors of Catchments Otago. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. But I do want to welcome you because, of course, we're going to hear from Professor Bob Costanza, who Catchments Otago has sponsored to come and work with us here in Dunedin. And also the last 2 days we've been working with Bob and Southland, particularly working with Environment Southland, looking at some of their issues and to what extent the approaches that Bob and his team have worked on over the years, how that might be applied in a practical sense in of producing solutions. And you'll hear more about this, I'm sure, as Bob goes through his talk this evening. Catchments Otago is an initiative supported by the University of Otago to bring a whole range of researchers together, right from the social sciences right the way through to the health sciences, the natural sciences, the whole spectrum, transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, with the aim of trying to look at problems which are associated with systems thinking. And again, Bob will say, I'm sure, a bit more about this shortly. But the systems thinking, not just within the University of Otago, but engaging externally with a whole range of communities, Environment Southland just being one example. So we've got a number of Catchments Otago members here, and I'd also like to thank not just yourselves who are here in person this evening, but also this is Bob's talk is being live streamed, so all of you who are watching this wherever you are, welcome also. So just a couple of words about Bob's background. Bob, I guess, would probably describe yourself maybe as an ecological economist or, a whole range of different backgrounds in terms of landscape ecology, systems thinking, ecology and economics, obviously, energy dynamics, a whole range of different areas which crosses the social sciences right the way through to the natural sciences, but particularly bringing together not just the economics in the sense of what we know today and we hear on Radio New Zealand and the economics reports that come in every hour on the hour, more or less. But this is how our economies actually could be rather different, how we could actually manage in the sense of, in terms of policy. So Bob currently is at the Australian National University in the Crawford School of Public Policy, but prior to that, Professor of Sustainability, Distinguished Professor of Sustainability at Portland State in Oregon, and prior to that in Vermont, and prior to that, Louisiana. Have I got that right?
Yeah. There was Maryland in between. But
Maryland in between. And a range of backgrounds from architecture through economics through systems thinking. So enough from me. I would like to welcome you, Bob. Thank you so much for coming and spending the time with us. And we really look forward to hearing your talk this evening.
Okay. Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. I actually took economics as a foreign language as part of my PhD. So I got enough of it to get inoculated, but not quite enough to get the full disease. Anyway, so tonight I want to talk about treating our societal addiction to growth and thinking of the reason that we haven't made more progress, I think, toward creating a sustainable and desirable future is because we're sort of locked in to a certain way of looking at the world that has very strong positive short-term feedbacks, but like an individual addiction, it also has very strong long-term consequences and costs that we're beginning to really recognize. First of all, we have to recognize that we live in a very different era now. We live in the Anthropocene epoch. Who's heard this term before? Okay, almost all of many of you. Good. Just to recognize that the magnitude of the human impact on our life support system is large, and we can no longer ignore that our interdependence with the rest of nature. We live in a full world rather than an empty world that many of our ideas were born in. This means that business as usual, I think, is no longer an option. We have to think and act differently if our goal is really to create a sustainable and desirable future, which I think it certainly should be. To do that, we have to understand, what do we mean by sustainable well-being? What does this desirable future look like, and one that can be sustained? And that's going to require the integration of these three elements of having an adequate vision, first of all, of how the world is, of how the world works, and our scientific understanding of the functioning of the Earth system, of the functioning of human psychology, what actually does contribute to human well-being from a psychological perspective. There's a lot of research and work going on in all of these areas. I think our challenge really is to integrate all of that research in a transdisciplinary way to understand how the whole system functions, humans and the rest of nature, but also to have an adequate vision of how we would like the world to be. What are our goals for the future? Can we build a shared vision of the kind of world that we want going forward? And there's certainly been a lot of progress in that regard as well. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, as I'll talk about later, are a very important step in that direction of building a globally shared vision of the kind of world that we want. One that is sustainable and desirable and focused more on well-being rather than merely economic growth. Our tools and analytical techniques then have to be consistent with that vision, and that's going to involve, I think, much more systems thinking and modeling, trying to understand how the whole system works together. In the sciences, we spend a lot of time on analysis and taking things apart into their pieces and understanding how those pieces work. We've got to spend at least as much time on the synthesis side of the coin, trying to understand how the pieces fit back together, how the whole system functions as a whole, and how it can go forward and be sustainable. And our implementation strategies then, I think, have to also change, and we need to develop new and better institutions that can handle and manage our common property resources going forward, particularly our natural and our social capital assets. And I think it's going to take some societal therapy, as I'll talk about. How do we make this transition? And like any therapy and any addiction, it's not easy. We can expect some relapses, and we're already seeing some of those in some places. But I think it's a process that we have to understand better if we really want to make this transition. So you've probably heard some version of this story as well about planetary boundaries and the fact that there are fundamental ecological constraints to the growth of at least the material part of the economy. Who's heard something along these lines about planetary boundaries? Not quite as many as okay. Anyway, this was a group of scientists got together and basically said, what is the safe operating space for humans within planet Earth? Not that we know exactly where the boundaries are, but where are the guardrails? Where should we put the guardrails in order to be safe? Certainly, we're exceeding that safe space in a couple of important variables like climate change and biodiversity and the nitrogen cycle, and others are rapidly approaching what you might call the safe operating space. So we have to understand better, where those biophysical and ecological limits and constraints are, and make sure that we stay on the safe side. We know also that the world is a complex, nonlinear, adaptive system. There are thresholds, there are tipping points, there are surprises to be expected. Both the biophysical world and the social world, I think, are subject to these kinds of phenomena. This is just from a paper by Tim Lenton and others recently about some of the tipping points in the climate system. If the ice sheets melt, we can expect climate to change much more rapidly than it would otherwise. And there's several other potential tipping points here. So, we are facing a climate emergency. Things could really get bad, much worse, much more quickly than we might have otherwise expected. And this is the way, these arguments are usually presented. We're facing a potential crisis. We're doing all the wrong things. We're emitting too much carbon. We've got to stop doing that. That's the normal way of framing these arguments. Not that it's not true, but that's not the movie that most people are lining up to go see. It's much more convenient to believe, the reassuring lies that are coming out of some parts of the system, in particular the United States at the moment, but elsewhere as well. So how do we change that? And I think the point is that we need a third movie. We need a much more positive vision and narrative about what a sustainable and desirable economy in society in the rest of nature could look like. And that sort of long version, I think, is there to emphasize that we're not talking about the economy versus the environment. We have to recognize that the economy is embedded in society, which is embedded in the rest of nature, the environment. We're all part of a natural system. It's not humans and nature, it's humans are nature or a part of nature. So making that fundamental shift in vision and worldview, I think, is an important precursor to being able to understand and manage this whole system in an integrated way. So we do have to stay within the planetary boundaries, but we also have to, create the elements of well-being and quality of life. As Kate Raworth has said, we have to stay in the donut. How do we do that? Well, there has been some work along these lines. This transdisciplinary field of ecological economics is devoted to trying to understand and manage the world, from a systems perspective. It has these three integrated questions or goals, that we first maintain an ecologically sustainable scale or magnitude or size of the human enterprise, so we stay within planetary boundaries, that we have a socially fair distribution of resources and wealth, not only within the current generation of humans, but between humans, between the current generation and future generations, and between humans and other species. So how do we fairly distribute resources? Certainly this has gotten a lot more attention recently as the degree of inequity in income, in many countries around the world has really begun to increase dramatically. So this is a key issue, and as I'll say later, this really does affect the well-being of society as a whole. We know that societies with less inequality are much better in terms of other social and well-being functions. And finally, an economically efficient allocation of resources, and we can't depend on the market to do that, because many of the resources that do affect our well-being are outside the market and should stay outside the market. They're public goods, they're common property resources. So we've got to get the balance right between the kinds of institutions we use for allocation. We've got to have a much fairer distribution. We've got to stay within planetary boundaries if our goal is really this sustainable and desirable future. There's many ways of talking about this. I think many of these ideas, are talking along the same lines. A well-being economy, a circular bioeconomy, a regenerative economy. China these days is talking about an ecological civilization that they're building, the donut economy, the steady state economy. I like the term lagom, which is a Swedish word that means just enough. So how do we create an economy where everyone has enough, no one has too much, no one has too little? So a lot of thinking along similar lines that I think we need to bring together, as I'll talk about at the end. But first of all, maybe step back to what the problem is with the old vision of the economy. And this is kind of a caricature of that, the empty world vision. I think a lot of our policies are still based on this idea of what the economy is and how it works. That we have land, labor, and capital, and land is kind of grayed out here because there's an assumption of almost perfect substitutability between these factors. We don't really need land or natural resources. All we need is more capital and labor to produce marketed goods and services, things that are traded in the market and measured by GDP. And then the more we consume of those goods and services, the better off we are. That's the main contributor to welfare. And some of that then has to be reinvested so we can build more capital and train more labor so that we can continue growing GDP, indefinitely. There's nothing in this vision that prevents GDP from growing indefinitely. And that's what you hear, on the news every day. The healthy economy is one that's growing GDP. Right? Anything that gets in the way of that growing GDP, that's bad, and we've got to stop that. So What are the problems there? Well, that vision needs to change to one that recognizes some fundamental realities. That, first of all, we live in a materially closed system. Everything has to go somewhere. You know, we are affecting the ecological life support system. And there are biophysical limits, at least to the material economy. You have to recognize that these four basic types of assets are all required in some more balanced way in order to produce conventional goods and services, but also to produce well-being more broadly conceived. So in addition to built capital, labor is better defined maybe as human capital, everything about individuals, their health, you know, their education. Social capital is all the direct and indirect networks we have among people, our institutions, our culture, all of the things that basically hold us together as groups. And finally, our natural capital, everything else in the world that we didn't have to build or create. And all of those things contribute to well-being in complex ways, and consumption is certainly not the only contributor. So well-being is a much more complex function than simply the more we consume, the better off we are. You know, our material standard of living is one contributor, but it's certainly not the only thing. Maybe a broader picture of quality of life or well-being, you know, would involve these three components. And there's been a lot of research recently on this idea of subjective well-being. Surveys all over the world where they ask people, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, you know, how satisfied are you with your life? So we'll take a quick survey. Who here would say 7? Who here would say 8? Who here would say 9? Who would say 6? 5? Really? What happened? 4. Yeah, the average, I think, for New Zealand, as I'll show later, is about 7 point something. But there's a significant fraction of the population who scores, you know, between 0 and 4, you know, about 2 or 3%, and another fraction that scores between 5 and 6. So these are kind of suffering or barely surviving, but you know, the majority of people, at least in developed countries, are still in the 7 to 10 range. But that depends on this whole range of human needs being met. And it goes far beyond consumption. You know, it's reproduction, security, affection, understanding, participation, leisure. You know, this list varies. It goes back to Maslow's, you know, hierarchy of needs, but more recently, work by Barbara Nussbaum and Manfred Max Neef, and they're different versions of this list. But the point here is that it's much more complicated than simply consumption. And even consumption is more often it's at the you know, beyond real need. It's really consumption for status purposes and not for the purposes of meeting needs. It's relative consumption rather than absolute consumption. So, and what can we do from a policy perspective? We can create the opportunities for people to meet those needs, to feel this sense of subjective well-being by how we manage our assets, our built, our natural, our human, and our social capital, and how we use our time. So understanding this whole spectrum, you know, of what do we mean by quality of life, what is well-being really, I think there's a lot more we need to learn, but I think we know enough to say that it goes well beyond just material consumption in complex ways. We know that natural capital and ecosystems contribute significantly to our sense of to our well-being. And who's heard the term ecosystem services before? Okay, many of you. You know then, you know, the benefits that people derive from functioning ecosystems. It goes beyond simply the timber and the food and the fuel that we harvest from these resources. Those things can contribute directly into market transactions, but many of the others don't. The regulating service of ecosystems and maintaining the climate and sequestering carbon, you know, regulating floods, purifying water. The list goes on. There are cultural services having to do with recreational amenities And certainly I've heard that tourism is now the largest sector of the New Zealand economy. And so a lot of that is based on the recreational services of the ecosystems that you have. There's spiritual and aesthetic and other cultural services and a whole range of supporting services, how the ecosystems are functioning to support the range of things that support this whole spectrum of constituents of human well-being. There is one thing missing from this diagram, I think, and that's the interaction with the other forms of capital that I mentioned, the human, the built, and the social capital. And I think our challenge going forward is to understand sustainable human well-being. We have to understand how these assets all interact, and that and ecosystem services don't just flow directly from our natural capital assets. They have to interact with built human and social capital in complex ways in different places and different cultures to produce this well-being. How do we better understand that? I think that's a very transdisciplinary problem as well. You're not going to understand this from the point of view of economics or ecology or psychology independently. Those pieces have to be put back together and synthesized. There's been a lot of growing interest in this idea of ecosystem services. You may have heard of the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. That's quite a mouthful, but it's kind of the equivalent of the IPCC, but based on studying and ecosystem services. There's a big report that will be coming out shortly from this group. There's the Ecosystem Services Partnership. Take a look at their website if you're interested in learning more about who's doing what in this area. And it's a large international group. There's a conference in Hanover, Germany this coming October if you're interested in learning more about that. The interest in the academic community has been growing quite exponentially. This is the number of papers published on the topic of ecosystem services over the last several decades. You can see that there are now, well more than 3,000 scientific articles a year being published on this topic. So, a lot of research work trying to better understand what these services are and how to value them. The most highly cited of those papers is this one that we did back in 1997, where we tried to estimate, with a capital E, the total value of 17 different ecosystem services across 16 different biomes, and we came up with an estimate, in the range of $16 to $54 trillion a year, conservatively estimated, but significantly larger than global GDP at the time. And I think this got a lot of attention because it's making that point that these are not small potatoes. No, this is not just some trivial externalities. These are services that really support and contribute to our well-being in ways that we hadn't really adequately recognized in the past. One thing we didn't control was what they put on the cover of the magazine. It was great that we got the cover, but then they put pricing the planet on the cover. We didn't really mean pricing, really. We meant valuing. And the distinction there is that most of these services are not exchanged in markets. That was the whole point. How do we bring in these sort of non-marketed but very valuable ecosystem services into the picture? The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which came out in 2005, also did some analysis of the loss of value that one often gets, when converting intact ecosystems to alternative uses. And often more than half of that value is of the social value is lost, of the non-marketed value. It's replaced with marketable products, but we're losing a lot of that social value, often more than half. We did a scenario analysis at the global scale, and we asked, what's the benefit-cost ratio of conserving our natural capital assets? And we said, what if we increase the global reserve network to cover 15% of the terrestrial biosphere, 30% of the marine biosphere? That would cost about $45 billion a year to build and maintain. But the benefits, the difference between the intact and the converted system, would be about $4 to $5 trillion a year. So benefit-cost ratio of 100 to 1, conservatively estimated. Anybody know of a better investment these days? I'm still not getting any answers when I ask that question. I did find one, though, and that was for oil companies investing in political campaigns in the United States. Unfortunately. So more recently, as I said, there's all this research that's gone on since that paper was published in 1997. And this is kind of a summary of the sort of range of values that people are getting by biome globally. And you can see that coastal ecosystems in particular, but range from thousands to tens of, or even hundreds of thousands of dollars per hectare per year when you add up the contribution of all of these services to human well-being. We then estimated, well, how have things changed between 1997 and 2011 in this case? Based on changes in our understanding of the value of those ecosystems, but also changes in land use. How much of each ecosystem is out there. We've lost a lot of coral reefs, we've lost a lot of wetlands, we've lost a lot of grasslands, there's been desertification. You take all of that land use change into account, and we've estimated we've lost about $4 to $20 trillion a year in the contribution of ecosystem services to our global well-being. So we're headed definitely in the wrong direction on that regard. This is not irreversible, I think, and some countries are really reinvesting in restoring ecosystems, but we have to take that into account. So that's the natural capital contribution. What about the social capital contribution? We know that this fair distribution is really essential to quality of life. This is from a recent book by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett called The Spirit Level, where they looked at the relationship between income inequality in OECD countries and this whole range, this index of social problems. And it's fairly clear that the higher the income inequality, the United States is up here, the worse all of these social problems are, including imprisonment, loss of trust, obesity, mental illness, etc. Scandinavia and Japan are down at this level. New Zealand and Australia are right about there. So there is a very significant connection between income inequality, fairness, and the ability to build social capital. We certainly know how to reduce inequality. We had been doing that for several decades, particularly in the post-World War II period. With progressive taxation and building the welfare state, income inequality was going down in all of these countries until about 1980, when it started going back in the other direction with the sort of Reagan and Thatcher changes in policies. So it's not that we don't know how to deal with these issues. We certainly had been dealing with them before. This is an interesting survey that was done in the United States not too long ago, where they asked a group of 5,000 Americans from across the political spectrum. They said, first they asked them what they thought the income distribution in America was at the time. They thought it looked like this. The top 20% they thought had a little more than 50% of the wealth. But then they compared that with the actual distribution, which looks more like this, much more skewed. The top 20% have more than 80% of the wealth. And then they asked them what they would like it to be, and they got something that looks more like this, more like Scandinavia. So it's not like this is what people want. It's the opposite of what they want, and they don't really realize how bad things have gotten. Although this issue is certainly getting a lot more attention these days of income inequality. We also know that that GDP per capita, which doesn't account for the distribution of that income and that production, it correlates with life satisfaction scores, up to a point. But beyond a certain point, you don't get much of a relationship. So GDP is not really a good measure of our goals for the economy. And even the people who designed and created GDP back in the 30s and 40s warned against using it, as a measure of national of progress. So when you're talking about growth, you have to talk about growth of what, and for what. And GDP really is only measuring activity in the market, marketed activity. It leaves a lot of things out. And it counts a lot of things as positive, which really shouldn't be counted as positives, as I'll talk about in a bit. So if you're talking about growth, what we really want to grow is well-being. We don't necessarily want GDP to grow. We may have actually decreasing GDP and increasing well-being if we understand what well-being is and what contributes to well-being in a broader sense. So, and of course, this has been recognized for a long time, including Kuznets. This is from Bobby Kennedy back in 1968, made a very famous speech about GDP, and argued that GDP measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. So it's not like we haven't known this before, but yet, we still are pursuing this idea that what we really need is more consumption and more economic activity. So we've got to be, I think, a lot more cognizant of what the benefits and the costs are of increasing this kind of activity and the other kinds of activity that might be better. So this is a piece we wrote not too long ago, arguing that it's well past time to get off of GDP, get off of our addiction to GDP as a measure of progress, and start thinking about some better ways to measure how we're doing as a country. There's a whole range of possibilities here. This is just a subset of some of the things that have been proposed as alternative measures of national progress. I'll talk a bit more about the genuine progress indicator, which tries to separate at least the goods from the bads and add things in that are left out. There's a whole range of things that look directly at indices of life satisfaction. The World Values Survey, Bhutan has a gross national happiness survey that they do, so that's one way of looking at it. And then there's a whole range of indices that people have put together from different components that they create and make an index out of it. The UN Human Development Index is probably the best known of those. A more recent one is the OECD Better Life Index, and I'll talk a little bit about those alternatives. I don't know if you can see any of this here, but this is from the World Happiness Report, which has been coming out every year recently. And this is just a summary of the average life satisfaction scores, of this 1 to 10 scale by country around the world. I know you probably can't read it, but the number one here, at least in 2016, was Denmark, followed by Switzerland, Iceland, Norway, Finland, Canada, the Netherlands, and New Zealand comes in at number 8. With an average of about 7.354, followed by Australia. So not bad, but one of the interesting things they did, and this is the top 30, I guess you can see those a little bit better. Norway was the first one there. Anyway, one thing they did was to try to explain how much of the variation in those scores was explained by GDP per capita versus social support, the social capital, healthy life expectancy, something about human capital, freedom to make life choices, generosity, perceptions of corruption, how their perception of how their government was working. You can see that GDP per capita was maybe 10% of the explanation. It's not zero, but it's certainly not everything. So how do we balance those things out and say how much do we really need more consumption and production? How much do we need better social support? Do we need better government? Do we need and one thing they didn't include in this was the contribution of natural capital and ecosystem services. It's kind of in the gray area of unexplained, but I think that also is important. This is the OECD Better Life Index. I encourage you to take a look at their website. The nice thing they did here was to take these 11 different indicators and start out by weighting them all equally, but then you can go in and change the weights, and then you can see what effect that has on the rankings of the different countries. So each of these indicators is a different color on this sort of spider diagram. According to them, Australia comes in first in terms of well-being, and in fact, they broke it down by city. And where do you think the best city in the world, according to their OECD Better Life Index, was? Take a guess. Canberra, Australia. Yeah. I don't know if that validates or invalidates the whole thing. You tell me. I like Canberra, though. It's really beautiful. So I think it's not bad. Anyway, but you can say, well, what if I think the environment is much more important than community, or if community is more important? You can go in and change the weights, and they're actually collecting the weights that people do use for that, and they're going to report back on that. And that's usually the problem with this approach of just taking a group of indicators and summing them all up. How much do you weight each one? Which is important to different people, etc. But it's one way to go. Finally, this genuine progress indicator is something that adjusts GDP. Starts with personal consumption expenditures, which are a major component of GDP, but then it weights those by income distribution. So if you're talking about welfare instead of income, you've got to weight it by how that income is distributed. $1 worth of income to a rich person doesn't produce as much additional welfare as $1 worth of income to a poor person. There's decreasing returns to income. And that certainly has been changing quite a lot in the last several decades. It adds a few things that are left out, like household labor and volunteer work, important contributors to well-being, but not counted in GDP. And then it subtracts a bunch of things that probably shouldn't be counted as positives. The costs of commuting, the loss of leisure time, the cost of car accidents, crime, family breakdown, a whole range of natural capital components, the cost of air and water pollution and noise pollution, et cetera. Impacts on human health as well. When you do that, and it's been done for 17 countries at least, there's been a few more now, including Australia and New Zealand, you get results that look something like this, where things had been tracking GDP for a while, but in the 80s and 90s, in some cases, in China's case a little bit later, things start going the other direction as the costs of that GDP growth, the impacts on income distribution and natural capital and other costs begin to outweigh the growing benefits. So we produced a global estimate of GDP per capita, which has been doing this since the 50s, compared to GPI per capita, which tracked it for a while, as I said, till about the 1980 or so, and then since then has been trending downward a bit. So we've gone from a period of what you might call economic growth to a period of what you might call uneconomic growth. The economy's growing, but it's not really producing improvements in genuine progress. So, hopefully these kinds of alternative indicators can become more popular. I think that New Zealand is even considering doing something like this more routinely. A few governments in the US have incorporated GPI into their policy and planning, starting with the state of Maryland, which has been estimating this alternative indicator routinely for a few years now. The state of Vermont has written this into legislation, so it's kind of required that they estimate the GPI annually and compare that with the and use it for policy purposes, recognizing that GDP is giving them not quite the right signal if our goal is sustainable well-being. There's a lot more work to be done in this area, and I think we need to understand that GDP really has a whole model of the economy behind it. The system of national accounts, the sort of input-output structure of the economy. It's a very linear, static kind of picture. And I think if we want to understand the economy in the context of society and the rest of nature, we've got to do a much better job of creating, more nonlinear, more dynamic modeling capabilities that can put all of those pieces together, and also tie it in with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are now the sort of consensus that has been achieved at the global scale and what we're trying to achieve. It could be a version of GPI, but one that includes not just the costs, but also the contributions, the positive contributions from natural capital and ecosystem services and from human and social capital. So I think it's an active research area. But in order to make this transition to a sustainable and desirable economy in society in the rest of nature, I think a key thing is breaking our addiction to this growth at all costs economic paradigm, to fossil fuels, to overconsumption. And a key step there is going to be, creating a shared vision of the kind of society that we want, and better understanding, what well-being is and how the economy works, how the whole system functions going forward. We did some research recently where we tried to ask this question, what can we learn if we're trying to overcome this addiction to growth at all costs? What can we learn from what works at the individual scale to overcome addictions, that could apply to the societal scale? Turns out that, the worst thing you can say to an addict is you're doing the wrong thing, you've got to stop doing this, it's going to kill you, and that's exactly what we've been saying, to society in terms of our environmental crises. Turns out that there's a therapy called motivational interviewing that seems to work well for overcoming individual addictions, and it starts instead by engaging the addict in talking about their life goals. Take it outside of the present into the future. What are they trying to achieve with their life? Once you've established that, then you can begin to talk about, well, what should they do differently to achieve those goals? So the obvious analogy there is, how do we get society to think about our shared life goals, our goals for society? As I said, the SDG process is an important step in that direction. It's the first time, I think, in human history where all the countries in the world have agreed on a set of shared goals. And I think there's a lot more to do here. And these are 17 sort of independent goals, and the challenge then is to say, well, how do those goals interact with each other? Their synergies and trade-offs, and how do they contribute to the next level up of goals of sustainable scale, fair distribution, and efficient allocation? And how do they contribute to the overarching goal of a sustainable and desirable and prosperous, high quality of life, that's equitable, et cetera. So understanding those interconnections, I think, is really the challenge going forward, and remembering that, we're talking about this system that's embedded in society and the rest of the biosphere. We've done some work along these lines, trying to encourage people to think about what this positive future could look like. This is just a collection of essays along those lines, where we ask people to say, what would the world look like if it actually met the SDGs, it was actually a sustainable and desirable future. There's been a lot of work also in scenario planning, not just creating one vision of the future, but saying, here's possible futures. Let's look at what the possibilities are, and then let's use that to help inform our decisions about the present. Scenario planning has been used in a whole range of different applications, and that helps people to think about, both the uncertainties about what could happen, but also to try to change our decision making to help us achieve the kind of world that we do want. I'll talk a little bit mainly about, in the Millennium Assessment, I mentioned use scenario planning. The Great Transition Initiative, I'll talk a little bit more about. This is something that's been going on for decades, where a large group of scientists around the world have established a group of archetypical scenarios, it turns out. And you can array them according to these two axes of, do we focus on GDP growth, or do we focus on well-being, more broadly conceived? Do we focus on individualism, or do we focus on community? The conventional business as usual, kind of scenario, market forces, you could call it, focus on GDP at the individual scale. You could have more policy reform that embeds more of the community, that tries to increase equity, more planning and government. The Great Transition is really focused more broadly on well-being at the community scale, that we're all in this together. We can have governance at many scales, and stewardship and sharing. And I think the SDGs sort of fit more closely into that whole scenario than into the others. But it has elements of all of them. How do you describe those scenarios? How do you get people engaged in thinking about the kind of world that we really want? This is not Not easy. Certainly a set of bullet points doesn't quite get it. Pictures help, but I think we need to go beyond that into the more elaborate, sort of videos and movies. And if you can imagine, a Hollywood blockbuster where the same characters are all, living in these 4 different futures, to get people to understand what those futures might be like. I don't know, is this enough of a description for you to decide which future you would prefer? We'll see. Okay, who would prefer the market forces future? Nobody? Anybody for Fortress World? No. Policy reform? It's not. Okay, everybody wants the Great Transition, is that true? You have to raise your hand. All right. You didn't raise your hand. You're still thinking. Actually, we did, and there has been some surveys similar to this in New Zealand back in 2007. I'm not sure if anybody's seen this report, where they had a set of scenarios similar in outline, I think, to the ones that I've described. As this is more like the Great Transition. This was kind of the business as usual. They asked people both, where they thought the country was at the moment, and they got a distribution of opinions. They asked them where they thought the country should be, where they wanted it to be. They got, most people wanted this Great Transition kind of scenario. And they also asked them where they thought the country was headed, and they got, the majority thinking it was headed in the opposite direction from where they wanted it to go. I'm not sure if that's still true, but that was back in 2007. We did a public opinion survey in Australia to try and get the public engaged more in this discussion. We changed same sort of scenarios, but we changed the names a bit because we got the feedback that the GTI scenario names were a little too value-laden. If you say Fortress World, that doesn't come across very well, but strong individualism, that sounds a little bit better, right? Free enterprise, coordinated action, community well-being, but similar. Then we created a website. We had, the description of each scenario in terms of bullet points of how the trade-offs that were involved in each one, and sort of a news report from the future for each scenario. And then we had people take a survey and tell us, which ones they preferred. You can see that community well-being was by far the first choice of the majority of people. Coordinated action was also the second choice of many. So between those two, somewhere in that range, we got at least 70% of the population preferring those scenarios. Not everyone, but a vast majority. We also asked them where they thought the country was headed, and they said, the free enterprise scenario was where things were going. So we also get the question frequently, well, can you actually have an economy that functions without growth? We're so locked in to the sort of need for growth in terms of the way the banking system is set up, et cetera, et cetera. Can we actually break out of that and still have something functioning? And these are a couple of reports that ask that question. Peter Victor's book, Managing Without Growth, and Tim Jackson's work on Prosperity Without Growth. Peter did a computer model of the Canadian economy and asked that question. It was a fairly conventional, model, but a dynamic simulation. And he found that, yes, of course, you could get a no-growth disaster if all you did was shut off growth, and everything else being the same. But you could also get a no-growth positive economy where GDP was stable, and unemployment and poverty were down, and greenhouse gas emissions were down and stable over time. And the question was, well, what would you have to do in order to get to that system? What policies would you have to change? And in the addiction therapy mode, there was a 12-step program. So the first one was new meanings and measures of success. So you don't want to rely on GDP as your goal. You want something like GPI or other alternative indicators for success. You want limits on material, energy, waste, and land use. You want to stay within planetary boundaries. We want to make sure that we're using things efficiently. We want more meaningful prices. So the price of everything we're buying in the market today is a lie. It's not really telling us the true costs. It's ignoring the impacts on the natural environment, on the social environment, and et cetera. And in fact, some work from this company, True Cost, that I've been involved with shows that many companies around the world, if you really estimate what their external costs are, they outweigh their profits. So they're not really making a social profit. They're just calling their external cost profit. More durable, more repairable products. So we don't want to waste resources. We want to reuse things to the extent possible. Fewer status goods. As I said, a lot of consumption these days is for status competition, not for real need. So if you reduce the number of status goods and spend more time on community goods and public goods, we'll be better off. More informative advertising. Much advertising is about trying to convince us that we're not happy, so that we'll buy the products and those will make us happy. But in fact, advertising should just be telling us what the products are and what they do. Better screening of technology. Technology is a good servant, but a poor master. So we don't want to follow technology wherever it leads. We want to say, what are our goals? How do we develop the technology that's going to help us achieve those goals? More efficient capital stock is similar to the more durable products at the on capital scale. More local, less global. The reason here is that local economies can also contribute to community well-being. It's not just about reducing transport costs and things like that. It's that local economies also help to build community, build social capital, and that contributes to well-being more directly, even if it doesn't contribute to more GDP. Reduced inequality, we talked about that quite a bit, the reason for that and how that improves well-being. Less work, more leisure. So anybody object to this one? No. Okay, this would be the easiest one to get into practice. But how do we spread the work more equitably, and allow more leisure time and get the work-life balance, I think, better for most people. And finally, education for life, not just for work. So, being here in a university, I think you should understand that. The purpose of education is not just to get a job, to make money, to buy things that we don't really need. The purpose of education is to improve people's ability, to understand the way the world works, to have a higher quality of life, because they're building their human capital, they're improving their social capital, et cetera. So, of course, there's always skeptics in the back of the room. This guy in the back is, we produce all these good things and this sustainable future, and yeah, but what if it's a big hoax and we create this better world for nothing? So I think that's kind of the point of my talk. We have to focus much more on the better world. We're going to solve all these problems, but if we focus just on one thing at a time, like solving climate change and focus on that as a big problem, we're not going to be able to understand the interconnections and the positive connections. That making these changes is not really a sacrifice. It's really a sacrifice not to make these changes in terms of our sustainable well-being. And the fundamental point is to change the goal effectively. And to frame these issues in a more optimistic and positive way. This is from a recent paper where they looked at the sort of optimism gradient in discussing these kinds of issues. And the current state of that is to have a fairly pessimistic approach to how you frame these issues. That doesn't encourage collaboration. It sort of gets you into this mode of the government taking a very top-down approach, that science and the public and industry are all sort of independently doing their own thing. That in order to get better engagement, you have to start framing things in a more optimistic way that can get cooperative contributions, to environmental management to make the world better for everyone. And finally, I think we need a much broader alliance among all of the individuals and groups and governments and et cetera that I think are thinking along similar lines. They may be talking about them using different terms, but in fact, there is a large group that needs to be recognized, and we're trying to build an alliance here. It's called the Wellbeing Economies Alliance, or We All. There was an initial meeting in Glasgow, Scotland, hosted by the First Minister there, Nicola Sturgeon, that included representatives from New Zealand and Costa Rica and Sweden and a few other countries. And this is progressing forward and building. So we need to build a movement, around we all. So we need the we 7 economies, or the we 20, or the we 100, rather than the G7 or the G20. Who are the governments, the communities that are devoted to building a future based on sustainable well-being, rather than a future based on continued addiction to the growth at all cost economy. So I encourage you to take a look at the website and join the alliance. So thank you very much.
Bob's willing to take some questions. Sorry.
Oh. You want to?
Would you please comment on the estimate of 33 trillion for natural capital when the real estate value globally is 280 million? I thought it would have been higher. And can you estimate what carbon tax would internalize the impact of our emissions?
How big should the carbon tax be? Yes. Well, the latest estimates of the social cost of carbon, put it at the $120, $140 a ton level. So I would say at least that high. And in fact, there are efforts recently to begin to have sort of class action lawsuits focused on the 90 entities in the world who are responsible for 2/3 of the carbon emissions, the major oil companies and et cetera, and begin to charge them for climate damages. There's something called the public trust doctrine in the United States that argues that governments have the fiscal and governmental responsibility to protect community assets, and that should include the atmosphere and the deep oceans, as well as water bodies and coastlines that it's been applied to before. So I think there is some movement in that direction to sort of directly go after the part of the business community that I think is standing in the way, and is the sort of most addicted to the current system, and is trying to protect, their stranded, should be stranded assets. But they're preventing, the movement in the direction that we're talking about, probably more than any other force. Of course, they get a very high benefit cost ratio from investing in controlling governments.
The 33 trillion versus the 280 trillion?
Well, 280 trillion for the property value. Yeah, well, that's a capital stock value as opposed to an annual flow value. So if you divide 33 by a discount rate, you'd get something probably much higher than that even. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I was just wondering where you see the role of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous worldviews in all of this, I suppose.
Sorry, say the last thing again.
In all
Indigenous
of this.
knowledge and
Indigenous worldviews.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think those worldviews are much more consistent with the kind of thing I've been talking about. That we have to recognize, that these are community assets. That private property has its limits, and we need to manage, and steward our resources in a much more community-oriented way. So I think they're much more consistent there. You have the Wanganui River, has been granted legal status as a person here in New Zealand, and I think that's sort of the idea, that we need to think of these natural capital assets as something that we all share together, that have legal rights as an entity, rather than then they're just material resources for exploitation.
Kia ora, Robert. Thank you very much. What do you think we need to do? What do you think needs to happen so we can transition into the well-being economy?
I think it's going to take a movement, including civil society, including academia, including NGOs, including we all. It's going to take all of us, I think, to come together. And I think it's going to take, also a clear vision of where we want to go. So how do we build that shared vision, and then begin to, get the global recognition that the majority of people on the planet, I think, share that vision. They probably share it already. It's a question of articulating it, making it apparent to the world, and making it, apparent to the political process and in terms of who we elect.
You mentioned motivational interviewing, and I just wondered if there's been any studies applying motivational interviewing in terms of trying to address the addiction to growth and consumerism.
Sorry, what kind of studies?
You mentioned motivational interviewing.
Yes.
I'm very interested in motivational interviewing and whether there are any studies that you know of applying that to treating addiction to growth or our addiction to consumerism. Has it been applied? Has motivational interviewing been applied in that area?
Yeah, at the societal scale. Yeah.
Well, in any studies?
Well, there have been certainly a lot of studies about motivational interviewing applied to addiction in individuals. Yeah. Yeah. Not that I know of, I think. But, hopefully we're engaged in that study now. Because I think the scenario planning, the sort of building this shared vision, this is the first step in a motivational interviewing kind of approach to overcoming this addiction. So we're in the middle of the therapy, hopefully, or at least at the beginning of the therapy. And and like I said, we can expect some relapses, and I think you're seeing a big one in the United States right now, but hopefully that will recover from that before we completely hit bottom.
So how do you expect us to get past that with the people? Sorry, over here.
Yeah, there you are.
Yeah. So the people in power who obviously benefit from the system the way it is, how can we move past that with those people obviously having interests in keeping it the way it is?
Well, yeah, I think that's why we need the movement. How did we overcome, racism and the civil rights movement? It's going to take more than just telling the current batch of politicians that they should do something different. Because the current batch of politicians, at least in some countries, maybe not in New Zealand anymore, but in some countries, is controlled by the interests that want to keep things going the way they are. So you're going to have to get beyond that and start having a movement that's both intellectually, based, but also political in terms of trying to change the way decisions are made. And part of that's going to be, getting the money out of politics, having campaigns be, and it's been said democracy is a good idea, and we probably ought to try it.
Thank you for your talk, Robert. You mentioned large numbers in terms of the loss of ecosystem services or natural capital. You also mentioned a 100-to-1 ratio of return on investment if we were to restore, I think that was. But if we look at the scale of the task, I suppose, of the deficit and therefore of the restoration goal, and we look at our capacity in terms of human and social capital, it seems to me we need a lot more granularity on where the best returns on investment, come from, where we should first focus our efforts.
Yep.
Do you have any pointers on that?
There has been quite a bit of research along those lines, that look at the issue specifically in those terms. Like what kind of returns can we expect from reestablishing buffers around streams and reestablishing wetlands and replanting forests in various ways. So I think it's an ongoing research effort China has invested billions, literally recently, in replanting forests because they were getting dust storms coming through Beijing, and so they sort of analyzed how to stop that most effectively. But I think that's an important open question because it's going to vary depending on the system and the history and what the most cost-effective way to improve things. But the research shows that in general it's a fairly high benefit cost ratio from doing those kinds of restoration projects. And well, one example that I know about is in Louisiana. The restoration of coastal wetlands. We know that the loss of those wetlands has really increased the damages from hurricanes and other kinds of storms. So now they're talking about, how do we redirect the sediments coming down the Mississippi River to restore those wetlands in order to not only protect from storms, but also provide all of the other benefits that those wetlands, provide in terms of fisheries and recreation and et cetera. So yeah, the idea of natural capital solutions, to these problems as an alternative to the sort of engineering solutions, I think is becoming much more popular and utilized.
I wondered if you had been requested to speak to governments at all, or is that something in the line of your work, or have people looking at consulting this type of information to present it to government bodies? Is that something that is in the future, or did you get involved directly with that one, and how we can encourage that everywhere?
Yeah, well, I think the New Zealand government is sort of one of the first participants in this discussion of converting to a well-being economy rather than a GDP growth economy. And like I said, some state governments in the U.S. are also on board with this, with the idea of GPI. So I think you're getting some traction in some places, and I think that we need to sort of build on those early seeds. Yeah, and having some governments on board is going to make it easier for others to join in once they see what's happening. So the early adopters are always few, risk-taking, but once you get the movement started, it can, I think, really grow. So yes, Alan.
Do you think we still have time? How close is a tipping point to the stage where we've lost control?
Yeah.
Our local weekly, The Listener, gave a lot of publicity a couple of weeks ago to a new book in the US, The Uninhabitable World. Oh. To what extent are we creating a world that is going to be potentially uninhabitable?
Well, certainly that's possible, but I think the alternative is possible as well. And to the extent that we stay in the pessimistic, fatalistic, way of presenting these arguments, we're making that outcome more likely. So I think that's not a direction that we should go. I think even though it's possible, certainly it's possible to have a more positive outcome as well. And I think we should try to make that the self-fulfilling prophecy. Not that we we go into fantasy land. We don't say, oh, everything's going to be fine. Because we know everything's, could very easily not be fine. And certainly the history of civilizations, is a history of collapse of civilizations. So, we certainly know that has happened in the past and it could certainly happen, to us in the future. But I think it's incumbent on us to do the best we can to try to prevent that and try to create a positive future. So.
Bob, thank you very much for your talk. Language is very important, in how we relate to things, how we think about things, and the term ecosystem services. You said and you showed up there how you had used it to, I guess, make people think about value, but it had been translated into a price. To what extent do you think that, do you regret being involved with it, like this term of ecosystem services, because it kind of shapes our thinking to think about nature as a monetary thing rather than something that we value for its intrinsic.
Well, I don't think it does that at all, actually. I mean, if you actually understand what the point is. Some people confuse ecosystem services, with privatizing nature or commodifying nature, but I think that's the wrong interpretation, and has always been, clearly the wrong interpretation. The reason you want to, and the point is, how do you understand the trade-offs, between the contributions of natural capital and built capital and human capital, and how you express those trade-offs, depends on who you're trying to communicate with. So you can express them in, terms of energy or time or money or, oranges or potatoes. But what's going to communicate, with people? If I said ecosystem services were worth, 33 trillion oranges a year, who would, maybe that's something people would understand, but people understand money because they know, how the relative value of that in terms of other things. But that's not the point. The point is that these are not resources or many of them are not exchangeable in markets, or should not be privatized, and that are contributing value that's in some sense equivalent to the kind of value that you get from other things, that people know about. So if you're trying to communicate, and I think the reason that paper got so much attention and so many citations is that it did just that. It put things in terms that could be comparable with GDP and other things that people understood. People have been saying the environment's important, and critical, et cetera, for decades, but it wasn't really having the influence I think that it needed to have. At least on the people that didn't get that from just a discussion of the nature of how the environment contributes. You've got to put some numbers on it to get the attention of a whole different group of people. And again, the point is, it's not an either-or kind of question. It's not like doing valuation that you can somehow express in monetary terms is the answer or the only way. It's just one more additional way of thinking about these things. That doesn't compete with other ways. It just is complementary. And the final point is, people say, oh, we shouldn't value nature. Well, we're doing it all the time. Every time you make a decision about how to treat, the environment, you're implicitly valuing it. So you can't avoid it. You can ignore it. You can ignore the fact that that's what we're doing. But I think we'll be better off if we make it more apparent, how we're valuing these resources, and how they're contributing to well-being.
2 more questions, I think, because get the clock here.
Yes, Robert, I'd like to ask, economics, as I understand it, is basically about managing growth. And for a stable economy, we need growth. And that's in direct contradiction with the finite planet. And I always come back to the fact that it seems that our monetary system requires that to happen. And we won't. I love your vision and your aims, but I think we run into that problem directly, don't we? I'd like to hear your view on that. And if I can have a supplementary, I'd like you to say what the difference between ecological economics and biophysical economics is, and whether there's ever chance of a marriage there.
Well, where to start with that one? Economics really should be about understanding how to effectively manage our household, and our household is larger than the market. It's really the entire system. So I think that's what ecological economics is trying to do, is to take a broader picture of what the economy is, what it's for, and how to understand it within the context of society and the rest of nature. The conventional view of economics is far too narrow in that regard. So it's not considering society, it's not considering the rest of nature. So we've got to expand that vision. And in terms of growth, as I've said, I think we're kind of addicted to growth, and part of that is the way the monetary system works, and part of that is the fact that the government does not control the money supply in most countries. It's controlled by the private banking system in terms of making loans, which they require to be repaid with interest, and so that's sort of setting up this whole Ponzi scheme. That is what we're addicted to. How do you break out of that? Well, you could reform the banking system. You could put the control of the money supply back in the public domain. With government, you could make fractional reserve requirements much higher than they currently are, so that banks could not, basically create more money. And you could change the vision of what it is we're trying to achieve. And I think that's the one fundamental change. Away from growth of GDP and towards growth or improvement of sustainable well-being. So that was my message again, in short.
One last question.
Hello. I was just wondering, in terms of an academic revolution, whether or not ecological economy or economics, was being taught at any universities currently?
Yes. Yeah, there are a few. Is it being taught here? No?
Yeah.
Who would like it to be taught here? Okay, who's in charge of this? I am teaching a course in ecological economics at ANU, so there's a course there, but I think there are a couple of places around the world where they have degrees or certificates, at the University of Vermont, I think, and in Edinburgh, and there is an international society for ecological economics, there's annual meetings, etc. So there's some activity, but I think there could be a lot more. And you get into lumpers and splitters. So you mentioned biophysical economics. I think that's basically ecological economics is not intended to be a subdiscipline of economics or ecology, or biophysical analysis. It's really intended to be a way to bring all of those things together. So it's sometimes hard to explain that to people who are in the business of trying to define their discipline and where the boundaries are, and we study this and you guys study that, and often you get into those arguments of where are the boundaries. Well, ecological economics is really trying to tear down the walls, not build new ones.
Okay, I think at that point, thank you, Bob, for sort of 15, 20 minutes of answering questions. I'm sure a few more minutes if you want to come and talk to Bob after the lecture, but we will be heading off in about 10 minutes. But Bob's here tomorrow, so and also the contact details, which you can see from the presentation here, and I believe the talk has been recorded as well as live streamed. So I might just say actually, this is a good opportunity just to say thank you to Cynthia Winkworth here. And Cynthia is the glue that keeps Catchments Otago running and being behind the scenes doing a whole lot in terms of making it possible for Bob to be here. So first up, please can we just thank Bob for his talk.